this week. It told us this. The ice caps are melting. Sea ice in the Arctic is collapsing. Water supplies are coming under stress. Heat waves and heavy rains are intensifying. Coral reefs are dying. Fish and many other creatures are migrating towards the poles, or in some cases just going extinct. The oceans are rising. They're becoming more acidic. Organic matter frozen in the Arctic soil since before civilization began is now melting, allowing it to decay into greenhouse gases that will cause further global warming, and the worst is yet to come. Climate change, it's eating into the global food supply, it's fueling wars and natural disasters. Yes, we've just had another report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It told us, again, they've been doing this since 1990, that our world is in mortal peril. And that was pretty much it. The news cycle marched on and the IPC report vanished quickly from sight, gone, ignored, forgotten by most of us. Is climate change just too big, too awful, too far removed? Why can't we quite come to grips with it? Professor Robert Gifford is an environmental psychologist. He's at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and he's made a study of the psychological barriers to both accepting climate science and to doing something about it. Robert, welcome to Sunday Extra.
Thank you. I'm glad to be there.
Now, these are the two big questions. Why do we find it hard to believe climate science? And even if we do believe it, why do we doubt our capacity to change it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, but perhaps we could start with the fact that we have this ancient brain that hasn't really developed much since the time that people were wandering around in Africa. And this ancient brain has a natural tendency to be mostly concerned about the here and now and not so much what seems to be far away and in the future. And of course, we're now capable of thinking like that, but our natural tendency is to kind of just stick with the here and now, and the rest of it is not so important.
So we're in this sort of constant conflict between our developed brain and our ancient instincts.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I mean, people who were in the small bands at that time, 30,000 years ago and more, were just worried about food for tomorrow, and they didn't care what was happening 10 miles away or 10 years from that. From then, they just were living in the present.
So is it just that fact that climate change, people talk about it as this thing, if you don't act, this will happen, but it will not happen in the immediate term? Is that the fundamental issue, or is it also the sort of the complexity and the size of the problem as well?
Well, there's many other reasons why people are aware of climate change but aren't doing anything. There's probably, I've made a little collection. There's about 30 different dragons. I call them dragons of inaction. But it sort of starts with the ancient brain, and it goes from there.
Tell us some more of those things then.
Well, you have different categories. People have what we call in psychology limited cognition. Some of it is our inability to deal very well with uncertainty, and even though it's becoming more and more certain, up until now, people have been able to say, well, I'm not sure, I don't see it in my backyard, usually. We have a tendency to discount events that happen far away. We have a tendency to be optimistic, which is certainly a good thing sometimes, but sometimes our optimistic bias, as I call it, allows us or causes us to be more optimistic than is good for us. And of course, the big one, or one of the big ones, is, what can I do about it? A kind of lack of perceived control. So those are some of the the one genus of dragons that I call limited cognition.
Dragons is nice. I wonder if climate science is hard to accept for all those reasons you've just pointed to, what is it about skepticism and climate denial that's easier to deal with, that makes those attitudes easier to accept?
Well, that's hard to say, because it's hard to get into the mind of people who are skeptics and deniers, or although I have two very good friends who are, and we have a continuing dialogue. But in my own experience, this is just a kind of block, I guess you could say. And, once you've declared yourself to be a skeptic or a denier, it's pretty hard to admit to changing your mind, I guess. And so some people kind of started off with this idea a long time ago, 10 years ago or more. But now to say, oh yeah, I guess the evidence is piled up enough, is not easy for some people.
Does the accepting climate science, I mean, in our deep psychology, in that ancient brain part of all of us, does this sort of overwhelming natural phenomenon threaten our sense of human superiority?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't ever thought of that question exactly, but I guess we do have a kind of a natural sense that we're on top of the world, so to speak, as humans, and to suggest that there's something bigger than us that we can't solve would seem to me to go against this kind of optimism bias that's been part of our DNA since we started inventing sharper knives and sharper arrows, and now we're inventing iPhones and whatever. And so there's part of us that thinks we can solve anything. So this is part of what I call our over-reliance on engineering and technology.
I wonder, though, I mean, that optimism bias you mentioned, Robert, why that can't be turned to the service of action on climate change, why that isn't, I guess, is it perceived too much as a negative? Is it not perceived as one of those problems that's an opportunity for action?
Yes, it is, but the trouble is, the dragon we're talking about now, I call it techno-salvation. That for the typical person, it's, yes, we can solve it, but not me. The engineers can solve it, or somebody else, can solve it, because it's usually not me that solved a lot of other problems. It was usually somebody else who invented this or invented that. So people are optimistic, but not that they can do something. They're more optimistic that somebody else can do something.
I wonder, that's the thing, isn't it? We tend to remove responsibility for this and many other things, obviously, onto our collective selves, onto the state or onto governments. Is there a psychological sense, too, that's troubling here, that we seem to have lost a bit of faith in those institutions as well? We've these two things, a bit of a pincer. We don't trust ourselves to act, and we perhaps don't trust those structures that might act on our behalf as well.
Yeah, so this is a dragon that I call perceived program inadequacy. It's a piece of jargon, I guess, but essentially it means, you can, I just don't trust. And of course, not just on this issue, but a lot of issues, politicians' reputation is not very high right now, and government in some places is not as respected as we would hope it would be. So, I don't trust you. I don't think you're probably telling me that for some other personal agenda. I don't think that what you're offering me in terms of some sort of rebate or program is an adequate one. So it's part of a general distrust of authority that's undoubtedly justified in some sense, but not always. And this is one where I think most of the people who are in charge understand the problem and are trying to do something about it.
Yeah, and it's a thing that changes, doesn't it? I mean, back in 2006, Al Gore's famous documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, was released. We had an election in this country that was, to a large extent, about climate change and about action on climate change, and then suddenly everything seemed to shift. The public opinion seemed to change. Your dragons, the psychology of all of us, are part of that, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. We have a couple of other dragons I can pull out of the den. One is jargon that I call book behavioral momentum, which is just a fancy word for habit. It's, I drove my car yesterday. Well, it's going to be hard to do anything except drive my car again tomorrow. The other one is called system justification. For people who are relatively comfortable, I don't really want to rock the boat or see the boat rocked because I'm doing okay. And what does it mean if I actually, or collectively, were actually to do something? Maybe my standard of living would go down. Maybe, something would happen. So I'm all right, Jack. Let's not do too much here, even though climate change is coming around the corner, I'm a bit worried that if we actually do anything, my lifestyle might be threatened.
We're exploring the psychological barriers to accepting climate science and to doing something about it with Professor Robert Gifford. He's an environmental psychologist chatting with you on Sunday Extra. I wonder, Robert, is there a tipping point when the consequences of climate change become sufficiently immediate and sort of in our faces to overwhelm some of those psychological barriers?
I think there is, and I guess my example may not make sense in Australia, but we in Victoria, it's probably the warmest part of Canada, but still we don't see pelicans here. But one day I was looking in the harbor here, and I saw a brown pelican, which is like completely off the scale in terms of something the last time I saw was when I was in Mexico. And it's that kind of thing when people see something that just doesn't, in their own life, in their own experience. So going back to the ancient brain, when the here and now is invaded by something that just doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't take much of a leap to say, I get that. I guess that pelican's up here eating fish that have been swimming up here, and it just doesn't look right here in our harbor. Or it could be some other plant or a pathogen of some kind. I think it's when people see it in their own life that they suddenly say, yeah, I guess there's something going on here.
What's your sense of this, though, cumulatively? I mean, do you think that those psychological barriers are too overwhelming for anything to be done that might, modify the effects of climate change? Is this, because of our psychology, something of a lost cause?
No, I'm a dispositional optimist myself, not in the same way I was mentioning before. But my honest opinion is this, that there will be infrastructure damage and other things, and it's kind of like, I don't know how it works in Australia, but usually what happens is after the car wreck, the sign goes up on the road that this is a dangerous corner. And I think that's what's going to happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years is we're going to start to see more flooding and more of all the other things. And then when people actually see it, they'll want to do something about it. Unfortunately, the cost could have been much lower if people were to do something about it now. But when they actually see the seawater lapping at their doorstep, then they'll say, yes, we need some dikes here to keep it away. And that just seems to be human nature.
Well, are there elements of our collective psychology that will help us out in that situation? That once we do have a general sense of things changing, are there elements of us deep down that will actually assist us in getting on with that job and doing something?
There is, and this happens to be the kind of research I'm doing right now, which is about looking at different kinds of messages that people are more amenable to responding to. And so there are many different possible messages one can send about climate change, but some of them are more effective in at least changing people's intentions than other ones are. So just for one example, an apocalyptic message, which you might think naively would be very effective, most people say, no, that doesn't work. I'm looking out my window and I don't see any apocalypse here. So they're just full of hot air, those people. But what does seem to work, as it did for the smoking campaign for 30 or 40 years, is messages that are about how it's going to actually affect you and your family. And this is the big change I see in the latest IPCC message is it's going to affect every person on the planet. This is actually using some psychology there.
Well, let us wait and see, Robert Gifford, whether that has the desired consequence. Appreciate your time this morning.
Oh, I'm happy to try to help.
Professor Robert Gifford, he's an environmental psychologist. He's at the Department of Psychology and School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, pondering there